Hey Sherry, how are you?
I am doing fine. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks very much for being here. Well, today, I've been doing this Ozark Mountain Publishing author series, and we've been talking about their books. And today's your turn. I've
Yeah.
had your book up here. So your book is called Peaks and Valleys: Integrative Approaches for Recovering from Loss. And so I would like to talk to you about that today. But as always, please start out a little bit with your background and how things started out for you, and then we'll get into the book later on.
Sure. Well, I've been a psychotherapist probably for about 25 years, and I worked in several different types of agencies. And when I started working in hospice, I took training on bereavement counseling and got my certification and so forth. And at that time, didn't think anything else about the training. And then I was also working with cancer patients and their caregivers, and grief and loss started coming up, especially with the caregivers. And then I have a bereavement group that I do with the cancer support community. And as I continued my career with all of these different types of agencies, I found out my nephew had cancer, and we went that journey, which was very painful. And when he died, about 6 months later, my brother died by suicide, and I realized all of the training that I had wasn't sufficient, and nor was it did it. I should say it really didn't explain. Um, how to help people through this journey, the stages of grief and so forth, were not helpful for me. So I went on another journey on researching and doing other types of training to assist myself and my family, and started doing workshops for other healthcare professionals. And people would keep coming up after the workshop and saying, "Do you have a book?" And I would say no. And they basically were asking, well, let me know when you have a book out. And one thing led to another, and I'm still to this day, I'm not sure how I had time to write a book, but I gathered all the information that I had, my family and I had went through, and that I had assisted other people um, to go through, and recognize this journey wasn't something that you go through stages and get over, and you learn how to live with the loss. And then loss, which I'll go into in a little bit, there's variations of loss. Obviously, the most challenging one is the loss of a loved one. And that's how the book came to be. So I'm still doing private practice, and I'm still helping people uh, go through the journey and relieve, grief at a what it's called somatic level, but we carry it in our bodies. And so I still do that work, and I'm still working at the cancer support community at this time and private practice, and that's all about me, I guess.
Well, do is this something that people can kind of help themselves out with, or is there a counselor or a guide necessary?
Well, yes, both questions. And what I mean by that is I wrote the book. There is some information in the book about energy psychology and the subtle energy bodies, in particular, and the way that our body holds emotions. And there's a little bit of teaching within the book. Well, I shouldn't say a little bit. There's a lot of teaching in the book. There's some story and some research provided, but it's more like a workbook. So, most people that have had any significant loss understand that it is a journey. And if they have the tools they need, exercises and techniques to do when they're having a difficult day, it is much more helpful than waiting until you can get in to see a therapist. Now, if there's a lot of trauma involved, which I said both yes. If there's a lot of trauma involved, I always recommend, and I did so in the book, that they see a professional that can assist them, especially using different energy psychology modalities. And that's a big, broad umbrella for basically using the acupoints on the body to stimulate and be able to release the emotions that are being triggered. So it may be anger, it may be fear, it could be sadness, it could be a variety of. Most people will describe kind of feeling like they're experiencing all of those, but they need some way of being able to what we call titrating the emotion down in order to it's kind of like turning down the volume on the pain in order to move through it. And if there's a lot of trauma involved in loss, then people more than likely are going to need some assistance, professional assistance, to help walk through that journey with them.
And so, based based on, let's say, um, I guess I don't know if it would be a good barometer. What I'm trying to get at is, based on all your experience, different experiences with different people. Obviously, it's 100% of people that are looking for help in that way. But generally, just if you do you know how many people out there really are seeking out this kind of help, or is it just kind of a hit or miss, or depends on each personality, or what is it dependent on? Because I'm sure there's people that they're tough on the outside, but mush on the inside, so to say, and sometimes they don't know how to that there's even anything really going on with them that needs addressing.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting grief and loss is it's an interesting dynamic that happens to all of us. So I'm going to go over what I mean by that, and I hope this answers your question. So anytime we have an attachment to anything, and what I mean by attachment is, if we become familiar with something. So, for example, if we have an attachment to a home and the home burns down and we've got insurance, et cetera, but we may have been really attached to the home, felt very comfortable in that home. It might have been a home that was given to us by a parent or a loved one in some way. And so the significance of the home, only that person would know. And so when people think about, what do you mean they're grieving the loss of a home? They have insurance, they can build it back. That's not, it's not a simplistic explanation, because there's a lot of attachments, a lot of things that home might have represented. And so those losses, the loss of the memories that transpired in the home and so forth, that can get a little complicated. And that is what I'm talking about, working through the grief of that loss. Now, it may be a perceived loss versus an actual loss. And it may be, and this is the one that's really complicated, and there's not a whole heck of I guess what I'll say, a lot of information out there about it, which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. We can grieve the loss of something we've never had. So if you, grew up and you had a dysfunctional background, your parents didn't, they may not have been able to support you. And I mean, there could be all kinds of drug abuse, all kinds of other forms of abuse. people can grieve the loss of something they never had, like a normal childhood or what we consider a normal childhood. They may grieve the loss of something they've never had, which may be what we would call a sense of being loved by somebody. And so those losses go unrecognized. And oftentimes, people will get treatment for the history of abuse, but they don't address the loss that came along with that. It's a kind of a silent experience several people have mentioned to me, and it's it's a complicated. It's kind of hard to describe, but when you use the different techniques that I've went over in the book, it helps people understand it from a of how they're feeling a certain way, even though they don't understand that feeling, and how that experience is it may be creating anxiety within them, and they're not even sure what they're anxious about. And I'm going to go a little step further. I've had people come in and they had no idea of any kind of loss. And I do hypnotherapy and ancestral. I work with people who have ancestral losses. And what I mean by that is, and science is actually coming on board and really helping explain it a little bit further. But if they've had ancestral issues, so for example, anybody that's went through, we'll call it the Holocaust, and their family members, some of them survived, and they are from that family. And those family members were in survival mode, and they were not able to release the emotions of the trauma and all of those things that they may have transpired for them. Then it can be carried into other generations. And so there's a big exploration of that. Now, from it's called epigenetics. Literally, our genes are programmed. For example, if our ancestors were extremely anxious, then our genes are programmed theoretically to receive the receptor sites on the genes to receive more, be open to understanding or how do I want to explain this? Feeling more anxious than a normal person would. And there may not be anything in that person's life that is really signaling that they should be anxious or that's triggering that anxiety, except for the epigenetics of it. And that could be anything that may have transpired. I'm using the Holocaust because I think everybody understands that that had to be a horrific experience for anybody that survived it. And I actually had a client. We did some work. We used hypnotherapy. We went in, and she had this experience as if it happened to her. We brought it forward. She did some of the tapping techniques on it, and we were able to release that the way that she was experiencing it in her body and resolve the anxiety from where it came. And she described having no awareness of it. She didn't know that her ancestors came from that time frame, but she had no awareness of having carried that along with her.
That's interesting. You say that, especially because when you usually hear grief, it's usually the loss of a person, which would kind of explain a lot. I was originally born in Bosnia, but I grew up in Germany. And my
Mm-hmm.
parents, still to this day, they will not let go of that house that they built there. I was telling them, just sell it. Just, it's already in Serbian territory, so they know they'll never go back. But they're
Yeah.
like, they will just not let go of it. And they get so emotional when they talk about, because it's a house my dad literally physically built with his hands, with the help of his brothers and all that. So I guess
Yes.
all of that matters. It's that energy
It
put in, I guess.
absolutely does. And the other thing I mention in my book is, oftentimes when it comes to that type of grief, some form of ritual, including some of the other um, well, I'm going to call it holistic modalities that are in the book, can often help people release that. And it it to other people, it sounds. I don't know. I don't want to speak for everybody, but they don't understand it. It may sound a little strange. What do you mean they don't want to let go of something like that? But I got in a car accident with a car that I'd had for a while, and I really was attached to that car. And one of the things when I looked back at it, I really was wishing they could fix it, but it was too bad of a car accident for them to fix. And I had to do, kind of a self review, like what is going on? Well, that is the very car that got me through a huge snowstorm when my nephew, the night that he died, they lived out in the middle of the country. And I still think I had a little divine assistance, but um, that car got me out to my sister's out in the country to be with her and her son the night that he died. And that is what meaning that car had to me. And that's why I had a really difficult time letting it go, even though they told me, no, it can't be fixed. It's totaled, it can't be fixed. And I had to stop and think, what is going on, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until I started doing research and really getting involved with the energy psychology modalities and working on my own grief and with my family that I realized it wasn't the car, it was the meaning and what that car had been with through me, or excuse me, been through what the car and I had been through with me. So that was the piece that it's indescribable. People probably would look at me like, "Wait, why are you attached to the car?" Well, that was the one reason why.
Well, yeah, especially, I mean, it's not it's not uncommon that people, usually always remember their very first car, because
Yeah,
all the memories and everything's so
yeah,
attached to that. Well,
yeah.
so I wanted to ask you, if you could, and as much, as comfortable as you feel about sharing,
Mhm.
what are some of the specifics, steps and tools that people can use, let's say, to start a process of relieving some of that grief?
Well,
Especially
in
something
my
that's in your book.
yes, yes, and in my book, there is a whole description on a modality called emotional freedom technique, and it's probably one of the easiest modalities to use without a clinician. You can do it on your own. And the reason why it is so effective is, you know, even in psychology, we're taught to, um, how do I want to describe? I'm sure you've heard of, excuse me, people giving you an affirmation, and you want to say this affirmation a certain amount of times a day, or put it somewhere where you see it so it reminds you of what the affirmation is. So the reason why affirmations often don't work is because they're hitting up against what we call, I'll just call it a double bind, but the actual term is psychological reversal. So it's hitting up against a, the exact belief that the affirmation is trying to eradicate. And energy psychology, the emotional freedom technique, well, the term and the statement sounds something like this, and I'll just give you an example. And by the way, in the book, there's several scripts that are written out just to get people started. Obviously, I couldn't make it specific for everybody that buys the book. So there's some generalizations in there, but then there's some specific scripts to deal with certain types of losses. But let's go back to the emotional freedom technique, and the general statement is, even though a part of me is feeling or thinking, so there's a blank there. So whatever feeling is or whatever the thought is. So it might be, even though a part of me is feeling very anxious, I deeply and completely accept this part of me. So it's about recognizing the anxiety, accepting it, not trying to avoid it, not trying to act as if it's not there, because that doesn't work. That's a form of repressing or suppressing an emotion. And it just gets stuck. And the next time something else comes along that triggers anxiety, then all of a sudden, all of the anxiety, all the times and ways you've ever been anxious come up to be resolved. And it can feel out of proportion, and it can feel extremely frightening to some people, depending on the situation. But that statement, even though a part of me feels anxious, I deeply and completely accept this part of me. You will do this statement while you're stimulating what we call, there's two stimulating places. There are neurolymphatic points where just kind of, if you come to right underneath the collarbone and you go down a little sideways, you press on them. They're often called tender points. And I always have my people cross their wrist over, because then you're bringing in the heart energy, and you stimulate those points while you're saying that statement 3 times, for example. Or the other point that you might stimulate is on the side of the hand. And oftentimes I'll just have people put their hands together and, you know, basically tap their hands together. I still like the sore spots. That's the original method through emotional freedom technique, because I believe it's also including the heart chakra energy, which is always involved with any type of grief, any type. Your heart energy is always involved. That's kind of the seed of our soul. And that oftentimes is where people will bring in, if you believe in past life or multidimensional lives, or even the ancestral energies that I was talking about, it is in the heart chakra that it is felt most frequently. Now, there's other ways and places in the body that it will show up, but I really have, I don't think I've found any particular client I've had in years. Nope, I can't think of one that didn't have some sort of heart energy involved with the grief. And so that's why I have them stimulate those points. You stimulate those points, you say that statement, you fill in the blank, and I filled it in with anxiety. But it can be, even though I feel lonely, even though I feel angry, even though I feel whatever the emotion is. But you can also fill in the blank with a thought, even though I think I'm being punished, even though I think I'm unworthy, even though I think or believe I'll never be able to get over this. Whatever. I mean, there's so many different variations of the way people's thoughts originate after a loss. But most importantly, what that does is it accepts the negative emotion or feeling, thought that is involved with whatever a client's talking about, whatever kind of loss it is. Once that's addressed, then the diagram and the points are in the book too, so you don't have to remember. but the main points are the top of the head, mid forehead. It's not the third eye; it's right in between your eyebrows, side of the eyes, under the nose, under the lip, under the collarbone. Then people, I tell them, give themselves a hug, but it's right under the underarms, and then sometimes under the breast. There's a variation of it, and there's a reason for that, but I won't go into it right now. And then side of the hand. And I have people do that tapping, or the book will have them do that tapping with the various scripts and recommendations. After they tap, you're going to really check and see. They call it a SUD scale. It's called subjective units of distress or disturbance. And all that means it's like a pain scale. 0, you don't have any. 10, it's extreme. And you just notice, did your SUDS level go down? Is it staying the same? Did it go up? And if it went up, that's when I start telling people, and I recommend it in the book, to see somebody professionally, because there might be some sort of a trauma involved that someone needs additional assistance with. So that's just one technique. There are several techniques in the book. Ritual is something I already mentioned, and ritual doesn't have to be any big, huge, fantastic thing. Ritual can be as simple as lighting a candle in the memory of someone. And I remember doing that right after my nephew died, and we came together on the holidays, excuse me. And I lit a candle in the memory of Shane, and I read a poem, and we just kind of all stood around and recognized that he's not there. Kind of called the white elephant out in the room, and then we recognized that in this case, Shane was being represented by the light that candle was significant, symbolic of. That is a ritual. It can be burying something. It can be burning something. There are all types of rituals that I talk about in the book: releasing, remembering, and reframing things. I mean, there's all kinds of different types of rituals that can be helpful for people. So that's just a little bit of an idea of what is offered in the book. A couple of exercises.
It's interesting you bring up affirmations. A long time ago, I learned that no matter what I use, no matter what I say, if the heart ain't in it, it's not going to work.
Yes, I know.
Because it's literally like throwing rocks against a wall.
Yes.
It's just, you can have this hope that something's going to change because I said it, I put it out there, but
Yeah.
your heart is just like, nope.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, I've studied various, I have been called a workshop junkie, but the reason why I did it was not every technique and not every tool that we have is going to work for everything. And the way I like to describe it is, for people that are mechanical and, they work with tools, they're not going to get a screwdriver out if they need a hammer or a pair of pliers. They're going to have to go, and yes, I know, in fact, I've done so. I've improvised with tools before, but after a while, sometimes it's just better to get a different tool. And that's what sent me into really learning various methods, because, I love Louise Hay, and she has all these beautiful affirmations, and they're wonderful and they're very healing. But if you have what's called the psychological reversal, that basic block, the incongruency, you say, I want to be happy, and a part of you says, no, not really. I'm kind of identifying with being miserable. I've been miserable most of my life. So literally, one of the techniques that I use is to address that very personality, piece of your personality, that identity that um, basically believes that if you release the misery, that it will cease to exist because it's been so identified with misery for most of its life. There's a part of us that will believe if I release misery, if I stop being miserable, a part of me will cease to exist. Well, that's not true, but that instinct of keeping something so that just in case, because I don't want that part of me to lose it and then forget or make the same mistake or whatever the situation is. I mean, it can be extreme at times. That is called an incongruence to the very thing we say, I want to be happy. So if we don't address those incongruences, those psychological reversals, and they happen quite often with people who have had losses. In fact, I don't use the stages because there's an implication that you go through stages and that somehow you're over it. And that may be true for some types of loss, truer for some types of loss. But frankly, that whole research was done with people who were actively dying. And yes, they did come to oftentimes an acceptance so that they could transition in peace. And as far as we know, their journey was over because they died, they transitioned. For people who have had loss, a death of a loved one, and when I say loved one, I'm including pets, by the way. Sometimes pets, we can be closer to pets than people. I mean, for some people. And why would you, one, want to be over or forget somebody that you love? That's not realistic. What you want to be able to do is remember them apart from the loss, apart from the trauma that you might have went through. People that are actively dying from cancer, for example, my nephew was one of them. I seen my sister day after day grieving, and our whole family was, and we knew he was going to die at a certain point, but that became very traumatic. And because PTSD is often referred to by people who have went through extreme trauma, through wars and uh, terrible catastrophic events. But PTSD can also happen to people who are going down this journey with people who are actively dying and they cannot do anything to stop it. So, I mean, the definition of PTSD, oftentimes under the diagnostic manuals mental health folks look at, is that you or yourself are under the threat of death and you feel like there isn't anything you can do to stop it. That can create PTSD. And that oftentimes is the last memories of those loved ones. And I've worked with people, I don't know, for years, and oftentimes they may have had 20, 50, however many years with their loved one, but all they can remember is that last few weeks or days that was so traumatic that they cannot get past and remember the good things again. And so these energy psychology techniques and some of the other modalities that I share in the book can help with that trauma as well, so that you can get past the really challenging, difficult time that you had with your loved one before they transitioned, and you can remember all of the other good things, and good time memories can come back. It's not that you won't feel that loss, but you can move forward through it in a way that isn't as well destructive for you or anyone around you for that matter. And then lastly, I just want to say, oftentimes when people, they mean well, but they'll say, oh, it will get better with time. Well, that may be true, but time is they have to do the work during that time, and time is different for everyone. And I've had people, after 3 years of losing a spouse, I seen a lady and it was acute as if it just happened because she kept herself so busy that she didn't process the grief. She repressed the grief, and it was as if he had just died. And we had to go through the whole experience as if it had just happened, even though it'd been 3 years. So I know people often mean well when they say, oh, it'll get better with time. But that is really, it's not a helpful, it's not helpful to say that. I'll just put it that way. Everybody's time's different, and the time requires healing to happen, but it's different for everyone. There's some similarities, but there's differences.
Sherry, when it comes to releasing some of the loss and grief, excuse me, it's important for every person. And so, of course, one can't really, put, I guess, some kind of a measuring device saying, well, this helped them way more, or this, this person, really appreciated letting go of that. Well, the other one, needed something else. So any kind of release that's bothering someone, I can see it's definitely 100% positive for everybody. But was there a specific person or a specific experience in your practice that a release of a loss was such a profound event for you or them that it was just really stuck with you more so than any of the other ones you work with?
Well, I've actually had several. One of them in particular was, and this is gonna, I'm gonna give you. I think this story might actually be in the book, but I'm gonna just to help you understand the variations of losses. So I had a gentleman who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it's not as common for men to get breast cancer, and he was the type of male that he rode a motorcycle. He did a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of mechanical kinds of things that oftentimes for men are known as kind of like, not to say that everybody buys into this, but he was in actually I was facilitating a men's group, and he was in this men's group, and he was talking about that loss of masculinity that he felt because, one, he'd been diagnosed with breast cancer, and two, the surgery that he had um, contributed to muscle weakness, because often they'll take lymph nodes out from underneath the underarm to make sure and see if they can get a clean margin. And so his strength was diminished. And he was talking about not even being able to to carry down a bag of water or softener, excuse me, salt for his water softener. And he felt so humiliated because he wasn't able to do that. He couldn't ride his motorcycle because he didn't have the strength to hold it up any longer, and didn't feel safe on it. It didn't feel safe to be on it with his wife and so forth. So that was a form of loss that often isn't recognized. And we talked about it, and he, at that time, I encouraged him to do some of the techniques in the book and so forth. Unfortunately, the cancer spread, and he did end up dying. And before he died, he talked about, one, how important it was that the group recognized that his loss of what he perceived his masculinity and all those things was so important to him. Nobody said, oh, You shouldn't feel that way. Nobody said, oh, it'll get better with time. Nobody said all of those cliche remarks. And again, I realize people aren't doing it, oftentimes aren't doing it to be hurtful. It's just not helpful. And so it allowed him a place to share that. And then he also talked about, being able to do some of these techniques to assist him with the anxiety that was happening as he knew he was going to transition. He knew he was going to die, and his wife knew. So it, they both kind of come to that understanding of walking this journey, and she used some of the techniques as well for the anxiety and the emotions. Now, I want to make sure and say these techniques don't eradicate emotion. It's not, in fact, who would want to eradicate the law? Again, I go back to what I said earlier. You love someone. Why would you want to eradicate that emotion so that you don't feel loss? It's not really, that's not what these techniques are about. It's about being able to release what keeps you from moving forward and stuck in a certain phase. And that was one of the things that I really learned was the stages of grief was the fallacy, which I'll go to what I was going to say earlier. So I took several different models, and I created something called the phases of grief. And those phases are shock. I mean, again, oftentimes any type of loss, there is a form of shock or disbelief. I can't, even though you knew it was coming, it's still, you kind of feel numb and on automatic maybe for days or longer. And then the protest is the second phase. And protest is when you're trying to oftentimes answer unanswerable questions like why them, why now, why this, what if, and trying to answer those what if questions and why questions. They're really oftentimes there's not really any answer for it, but there's just that protest phase of trying to figure out if something had only been different, would you had a different result. And then there's disorganization phase, and that's when you really recognize that type of loss. So we'll talk about the loss of the loved one, going back to the woman who lost her husband. They had cooked out every Thursday night, and every Thursday night after he died, she couldn't be at home because it reminded her of Thursday night was the cookout night. Everything was disorganized. Things that they used to do together were no longer a part of her life. And it just, all of the routines and habits and um, things that even busyness kinds of things she was very aware of were not the same after her husband died. And then this reorganization happens where you're starting to make new, we'll call it habits and routines apart from what you've lost. In this case, her husband. She may be going out, which she was on Thursday nights with the friends because her husband was no longer there to cook out on Thursdays. She started recreating things. And oftentimes people get stuck there because they feel like, oh, wow, I must not have been a very good wife, mother, their role was, because I'm starting to move forward. And they'll get stuck in that reorganization phase. And that's oftentimes when I have people do some sort of memory exercises, a memory book, a ritual of some sort to remind them they're not going to forget the memories. They're not going to forget what they've lost. And creating a memory book, a memory box, things like that can also assist people in moving forward. And then there's the recovery phase, which really is if you're going through those phases, if you haven't got stuck in a particular phase, you are actually in recovery. So that goes all the way back to, the variations of loss. Sometimes people are going to go through those phases at a different rate than others. If they're stuck in one, then there's some assistance needed. And oftentimes, wherever they're stuck at, that can be symbolic of the help they need to move forward, to continue to move forward. And those phases I have in the book as a basically a circle, but it really is kind of, which can't put moving parts in a book, but it really is one of those things where it's like instead of spiraling downward, you're kind of moving up, and you may experience um, that deep level of sadness on a lesser degree, uh, and not as often, etc. It really just depends, again, on the loss, the person, etc. So that was a significant one because I had never really thought about, yes, the man died, but while he was dying, that loss of masculinity and all of those things were other types of losses, if that makes sense. I mean, that's just one. I've got lots of stories, but that was one of the significant stories that I still remember to this day.
Well, Sherry, no, that was great. Thank you very much for sharing that. And it's yeah, no, it's one of those things to where when it comes to especially family members or someone that's close to you, everyone has challenges. I don't know. I
Yes,
personally, just from personal experience, if there was ever a list, I would usually put that at number one of all the things that are losses and people deal with throughout life.
yes, yes. And I cannot and reemphasize enough that losses can be things that you've never had to. So it could also be losses or disappointments of, in fact, I had a client today where she had her children when she was young, and her children kind of went in the wrong direction, and she's blaming herself. And she was describing that loss of not having the love. In other words, she never had the love that from her children that a lot of parents just assume that's part of. So when kids make choices, oftentimes parents can blame themselves, but they go through a form of loss. And that really needs to be addressed because energetically, the best way I can explain it is it's kind of like a ripple effect. And so the energy work that I describe in the book is very important for that kind of work too, letting go of the um, subtle energy blocks that may be there, and letting go of the belief that everything your adult children do is your fault. And I mean, there's just variations of it that I've worked with so many different people. And oftentimes, women in particular, because of the umbilical cord, there's a form of cording that happens, energetic cording, which is a lot deeper than I can get into in this call, but it is there, and it can be a very challenging issue to work on if the therapist doesn't understand the subtle energy bodies, meridians, and all of the dynamics that can go on with different forms of loss.
Well, Sherry, thank you very much for that information. I certainly hope that people seek out your book and learn more of what you have to talk about and use those tools
Great,
for themselves. Of course,
great.
I will have your links in the description below. But if you maybe would like to leave us with a website or some other pages you would like to share, please do that if you can.
Well, my website is, it's a long one. It's mind, body, spirit integrations.com. And it is on the back of the book. And I got to tell you, it's got to be updated. That's on one of my things to do list. I've got to get it updated. And I guess the only thing that I can say is I know there's some through Ozark. There's some YouTube videos out there that can go in detail a little bit further about some of the things that I've shared. I also belong to an organization called Association of Comprehensive Energy Psychology. And that organization, if you go to their website, there's a link called practitioners on there, and it drops down and it will show you all the practitioners in an area that does energy psychology work. Now, keep in mind, not everybody specializes in grief and loss, and I do work virtually with people for that type of thing as well. Or if you're local, I work in person still, and all of that information is on there as well, my website, etc., and the variations of types of training that the practitioners that are listed there are also available for anybody that feels they need additional help. Again, the book has a lot of those resources in it too.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. And,
All right.
I certainly hope people take advantage of, of getting your book and reading about it. Well, Sherry, it was nice to meet you, and I hope we can do this again. So I appreciate it,
Great.
and, hope to see you in the future again sometime.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.